This is Dr. Fox. Thank you all for your continued support for CRPN and CRPN Central. For more information about our mission, please contact us today at info@crpaynet.com for details.
Congratulations, site. You've been awarded the trial. Here's the CTA and budget. Please review, and if you approve, sign the agreement so we can get started.
Hey, thanks, CRO. We look forward to working with you. We looked at this budget, and it's dangerously low. Here's the budget counter to realign it to the actual cost of the trial.
Whoa! That budget is way above fair market value and any level that we are comfortable with paying. Sorry, but here's the counter budget. It's the max that we can do.
This counter is still very underfunded. We're really sorry. We work really hard to monitor our costs, especially since this is such a long study.
Sorry, but your numbers just aren't fair market value. You could always amend the contract later if it's not enough money.
Well, we really do need this trial to keep going. Okay, as long as we have the option to amend the contract, we could probably start off with this budget.
6 months later.
Hey, CRO, this budget just isn't working out. It's too low, and we need to adjust it to pay for all of the...
It's been too soon since you signed the agreement, site. Sorry, but we followed fair market value. If it's costing you more than the market, maybe your site is too expensive to run.
Every patient we enroll in the trial is literally costing us money. Consider enrollment halted until we can adjust the budget to the true cost of doing this research.
Money, the most common conversation between site administrators and our industry collaborators, and likely the number one reason why trials continue to fail before they even begin. Sites are approached with unrealistic budgets with a claim to be fair, when their notable underfunding of trial services generate nothing but a fake certainty. And then, when sites question this mysterious value determinant, they are only given false promises that are never redeemable throughout the course of a trial. Sites, you and only you should know and be confident in your organization's fair market value. Understand that with almost a 100% certainty, the budgets you receive for your trials will be completely underfunded, and they will leave you with boatloads of risk for years to come. When you agree to underfunded budgets, you aren't just risking your current trial's quality, but also the financial stability of your site peers as a whole. Sponsors, starving sites for the resources they need to best serve you is completely counterintuitive. If you're really looking for ways to cut your budgets in clinical research, perhaps it's time to reallocate money away from our traditional, archaic, and inefficient management and administrative practices, not from the patient-facing professionals who work diligently every day to ensure your continued success. Welcome to CRPN Central, the official podcast of the Clinical Research Payment Network. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Fox. CRPN Central discusses the real issues with our clinical research industry to explore and identify mutually beneficial solutions for all of our stakeholders. Fair market value benchmarking is an established practice in clinical research to predict costs, establish standardized budgets, and pay sites and investigators according to strict legal and regulatory requirements. And yet, we experience routinely these values are not only unfair, but also completely underfunded compared to the actual resources sites need to successfully perform research. Why are fair market value payments to sites so inaccurate compared to the actual costs of performing clinical trials? Today, we will discuss fair market values in clinical research, defined by the United States Supreme Court in United States v. Cartwright as the price at which property would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither being under any compulsion to buy or to sell, and both having reasonable knowledge of relevant facts. First, we will discuss fair market values with an experienced site network owner. Then, we will discuss fair market values with two highly experienced regulatory and legal experts. To maintain valid comparisons, both interviews will use the same questions, and my guests did not know the questions before the interview. We will reconvene after the interview to compare guest answers and perhaps begin to understand the noticeable disconnect between the intention of fair market values and the observed fake market values that we see today. Our first guest is an experienced clinical site network CEO and an industry leader for site and diversity advocacy. Wenoah Veikley is the CEO of Access Research and the president of Diversity Research Solutions, both organizations dedicated to offering clinical research opportunities to northern New Mexico and beyond. Wenoah is a star site expert in our industry, and I'm thankful she has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome Miss Wenoah Veikley. Wenoah Veikley, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. Would you be willing to give the audience a brief introduction?
Absolutely. I am the CEO and Chief Clinical Officer at Access Research, primarily based in New Mexico, but with satellite sites in El Paso and Salt Lake City. We are a small research network of 4 sites at the moment. We have historically specialized in infectious disease work, HIV, hepatitis, sexually transmitted infections. For the last few years, obviously also worked with COVID.
Needless to say that since the COVID pandemic, you've been pretty busy.
We actually started up in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I had been living overseas and came home in the summer of 2020 and started up in November of 2020. I had been working in HIV and STI and hepatitis research for about 17 years at that point, and our local research community had closed their program. And so we stood Access up very, very quickly in the middle of the pandemic.
You found a significant unmet need that was a result of a closure. You stood up and you filled that gap for your community.
We did. We historically had very solid relationships in the HIV treatment world, hepatitis treatment world, because any drug that had been approved for HIV or hepatitis C over the last couple of decades, we had done work with almost all of them. When I was living overseas, that work was being carried on by a local not-for-profit, but they closed during the pandemic. They closed their research program, and that meant that there was nowhere in New Mexico to access any COVID trials, whether they were vaccine, testing, or treatment. All the way reaching to Denver, Phoenix, or Houston or Dallas, there was this huge empty space in our geographic region. We felt like it was important to fill that gap, and because a number of the companies that work in infectious disease had pivoted their resources to COVID, it afforded us an opportunity to engage with stakeholders that were already familiar with us.
Today's topic is fair market value. It's something that we have to live with every day. I'm going to ask you a series of questions today, and I'm going to ask these same questions to another set of interviews. And when we're done, we're going to compare the answers and the opinions about these just to see if we can find some alignment between our opinions about fair market value and what they mean to our industry. And then maybe we can try to figure out how to utilize our terminology in clinical research for the good.
That sounds good.
Will you walk me through your current understanding of our industry's fair market value?
I would suggest that if you asked 100 people and mixed in CROs, sponsors, and sites and larger academic centers, you would probably get 100 different responses. But I will reflect that from our perspective, fair market value is what we understand the services that we provide are worth in the market that we offer those services. We know that those services are worth that because that's what it costs us to provide those services, and that's what sponsors and CROs understand they should be willing to pay. Having said that, there are varying definitions of fair market value that would suggest if you've been paid it once, then you've now reestablished your fair market value. If you are discussing fair market value in the context of a negotiation, it is presumed that both parties are operating in their own best interests and will negotiate. But that negotiation is meant to be free of coercion or undue influence. I would suggest that for smaller sites, fair market value has the potential to be impacted by larger CROs or sponsors who say, if that's what you're calling your fair market value, then we don't need to give you the study. For us, that does not feel free of coercion or undue influence. I've worked in Los Angeles. I ran a clinical program on the street between Beverly Hills and West Hollywood. I understand what real estate costs per square foot in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills, and I know what it costs in Santa Fe, New Mexico. What I will tell you is that fair market value in Los Angeles, where there are infectious disease providers in the same building offering the same study, looks different in a setting where there are 2 infectious disease providers in the entire state of New Mexico. I am paying a premium for services, and the assumption is often that our fair market value should be lower because we're a smaller site and we're geographically more remote. The context of scarcity of resources is never considered in that conversation.
I've run into that as well. We live in the rural Midwest. Good luck trying to maintain specialists in the middle of a cornfield. You have to pay a premium.
Who are trained in their specialty and trained and willing and have the bandwidth to participate in clinical trials.
You're likely going to have to pay them more than what they would see at their clinic.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's going to be a lot more work around it. When I go through a budget negotiation, someone comes up to me, here's a budget negotiation, I counter, and they say, well, this is not fair market value. I said, well, how did you get fair market value? And they said, well, we do benchmarking. We pay $60,000 a year to access what I call the contract graveyard of these old and archaic contracts. So they're comparing me not to my contracts, but to the contracts of an entire industry of sites that I have never met before, that I had no control over how they negotiated. And they're comparing my prices and what I need to what other sites in the industry are trying to tell them.
Absolutely. One of the challenges also becomes the idea that there's zero transparency in how you arrive at fair market value. As a site that has worked on studies where there are 40 participants in the world, and we enrolled 3 of them. So highly complex, highly detail-oriented studies. We have worked on those, and we have worked on what we affectionately refer to as one and done device trials, where they're non-interventional, there's very little risk, there is no intervention, and the engagement with the participant is fairly nominal. The other challenge when you talk about the contract graveyard is that there's no stratification for complexity of a study. Don't tell me that my 6-page informed consent for an additional nasal swab is going to get valued at the same as my 39 or 40-page consent for an investigational trial involving 3 new IPs, a novel delivery system over the course of 3 years. That informed consent process should never be expected to consume the same amount of time or professional resources, nor should it be compared to a study that requires zero intervention and very nominal involvement with the participant. For us as a site, when there's no transparency in how CROs or sponsors are arriving at fair market value, the assumption is that they're just pooling all of that information. You would assume that because we work in clinical research, we would understand the significance of stratifying your data.
Exactly. The irony behind it.
Exactly. This is what it looks like to compensate for a non-interventional, single visit, non-complex study versus this is your median or your fair market value for a more complex study that has considerably more interventions along with a longer time frame and highly complex resource allocation.
Fair market value was developed for a reason. What do you think are the benefits of fair market values?
The intention is to reflect that no undue positive or negative pressure has been placed on someone to conduct a clinical trial, so that we are not being induced by being overcompensated. We are not being coerced into doing something for which we are not being adequately compensated. Fair market value was intended to level the playing field, to say this is how much we believe it costs for you to do that, and we're going to compensate you fairly, and we're not going to compensate this site down the street at twice what we're compensating you just because we happen to like that doctor or because that person is related to somebody on our team. It is meant to level the playing field and to demonstrate that scientific integrity and participant care has not been influenced unduly by how you are getting compensated to conduct a trial. The rationale seems reasonable. Having said that, the conversations are often stunted by the suggestion that we would be price fixing if we have conversations with other sites about what we're getting compensated, that we are somehow collaborating in a way to cheat sponsors or CROs by saying that this is how much I get compensated for this particular procedure. For us, fair market value is meant to reflect a level playing field. However, what's being reflected to us from the industry is that we have no right to ask how they arrived arrived at what the playing field should look like. And we don't know if any of us are playing on the same field. I have no idea what my colleagues are getting compensated for participating in exactly the same study, because to have that conversation, I've been told, would result in unfair price fixing.
You have to look back to the days where you go to this doctor and you say, hey, would you like to be in this trial? Here's a cruise. Here's a vacation for your family. Here's all of these millions of dollars. Here's some stock shares. By the way, are you sure that wasn't SAE? That's not right. There's a reason why Stark and Sunshine and all of these policies have been in place for fair market value. I'm not saying fair market value shouldn't exist, because I do think that the intention was to provide protections to sites, just as you said, for a fair market and independent contractors, but most importantly, to provide an unbiased clinical research experience for good data.
For integrity in the science.
It has been interpreted by the people who hold the contracts and the budgets as a way to get the lowest possible price. Not necessarily fair, but the bottom line. Have you ever heard the word max during negotiations? This is the max we're going to go.
Oh, yes.
This is our max. I always tell them, honestly, I don't care about your max. I care about what it's going to cost to do this research. And if your max isn't enough, then maybe I'm not a good site for you. And guess what? That max just mysteriously disappears. I have to always protect the integrity of my patients and their experiences. That has nothing to do with the amount of money that sponsors think they're going to pay.
I would agree. It's the idea that somehow someone has set an arbitrary ceiling on what it's going to cost to conduct a study safely and accurately and with integrity in the data. And the challenge becomes, at a certain point, we're incentivizing CROs and sponsors to pay less and expect better quality is counterintuitive. To suggest that this is the max, well, if this is the max, then this is the only amount of time I can afford to spend on data entry and patient care and reporting and data integrity. It feels like you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. Your benchmarks shouldn't be what your max is. Your benchmarks should be related to appropriately enrolling and documenting the care of the participants in the study in a timely way and accurately reflecting the impact of the treatment or the intervention on the participants or the absence of that particular effect. And so it seems counterintuitive to say, this is the maximum we're willing to pay you because we have figured out in some random way what the maximum amount of effort this should take for you to do it, without engaging in a conversation about what is actually the effort it's going to take you to do it. Because then you're encouraging a random negotiation that has no basis in reality. You've arbitrarily set your ceiling, which makes me assume that you are not basing that in reality. So I am then forced to respond with something that may or may not reflect the actual amount, because I need to get to where I know it's going to cost me to conduct this work. We end up in some weird haggling process, like we're at a market somewhere where we're buying stuff off the street instead of talking about participant care, scientific integrity, and safety.
Honestly, for me, max is a trigger word. I get angry because when they tell me this is the max we're going to give you, it tells me they don't care about patient safety. They don't care about the data. They don't even care about the quality. They only care about the amount of money that they're going to pay. If you ever negotiate with me and you use the word max, expect the boxing gloves to come off. I will make sure that I get as much as I can, because now I know that I'm going to need it to do this trial because it's so underfunded. What do you think are the limitations of our current fair market value systems?
The lack of transparency and the lack of a dialogue. We are provided limited information, so there is no transparency in how sponsors or CROs have arrived at what they're offering, and there is no dialogue to find out how we get to something that is mutually agreeable. And because there's no transparency and no dialogue, you are effectively pitting your sites against your CRO or the sponsor. We operate in a universe where data is the epitome of all things real and important, and we have no data in this particular arena as it relates to the work we conduct. We have zero data provided by sponsors or CROs to understand how they arrive at what they offer. So if there's no transparency in understanding how they arrived at their proposed fair market value, then how are we intended to have a dialogue? Because there is no conversation to be had in the absence of any information. information. I have gone line by line through budgets and provided justification in terms of time and effort. And this is how much it costs me. And still bump up against, nope. Once I've had the ability to have that conversation with a sponsor or a key stakeholder at the CRO, and they can understand that I'm not just making it up, that dialogue becomes a critical component to our being able to successfully arrive at something that everyone is comfortable
Why
with.
can't sponsors just come straight to sites during the planning stage and try to get true ideas of fair market value before the negotiations start?
Well, that would be lovely, even from a scientific perspective, in terms of the realities of executing a clinical trial. We have somehow gotten away from the idea that sponsors and sites should be partners in this process. Sponsors want data. They want clarity of information about whether or not whatever they have provided functions the way that they believed and needed to make it safe to offer to the community. That should be a partnership. The sponsor should be invested in a site's success, and a site should be invested in a sponsor's success, in as much as sometimes it means helping the sponsor understand that this is not the right product to bring to market, or that this product does not represent what you need it to represent as accurately as you need it to. That should be a partnership. And what I have seen over the last 22 years almost that I've been doing this work, the sponsor and the site are getting further and further apart. There's a pattern now of involving one CRO for budget and contract negotiations and a second CRO for study execution.
It's a nightmare.
It's an even more profound separation between the site and the sponsor in terms of understanding what needs to happen on the ground level for the study to be executed successfully.
And you wonder how many hours of savings we could provide our sponsors if they just came to us to talk about money before they negotiated with hundreds of sites. Talk to one site, have a real conversation, and save a ton of money on personnel time, on CRO billable hours, on all of these things that could have been avoided if we just talked about the right thing at the right time.
How many times have we seen amendments and new informed consents based on very simply avoided errors?
Oh, yes. You sit there saying, there's no way this could have worked in a clinic. Why didn't you talk to me before you wrote the protocol? We could have prevented this.
Exactly.
We talked about fair market value. We talked about the goods, the bads, the uglies, the expectations. Every time we negotiate a budget, we are told this is fair market value. We look at the number and then we look at our costs and we realize the number does not pay for the costs. Therefore, I don't know whose definition of fair this is, but it doesn't pay the bill. Why do you think we see such a disparity between what people call fair market value and our current trial costs?
It's exactly what we started this conversation with. They are using limited and outdated data points, and there is no transparency or critical evaluation of the data points. If you are telling me that my informed consent costs too much money in my phase 1 or phase 2 trial, and you're comparing it to the data points associated with a phase 3 non-interventional trial, then we're not comparing apples to apples. We are now comparing pineapples and apples. Pineapples are more rare. They're harder to get. They're a scarcer resource. They're more expensive to transport. There's not as many of them as there are apples that are growing in our backyards. If you are going to tell me that a pineapple should cost as much as an apple, then we are fundamentally going to disagree. My pineapple didn't grow in the backyard. I spent a lot of money bringing my pineapple in from somewhere in the Caribbean or somewhere in Southeast Asia. Took a lot of resources to get there. It took a lot of jumping through hoops to find its way into my possession in a way that is different than me walking into my backyard and picking an apple off my tree. There is a different level of effort involved.
Do you feel as though anyone benefits from this disparity?
No, we end up automatically assuming that nobody is operating from a place of integrity or knowledge. They're just negotiating for the sake of negotiating. We are not negotiating in good faith because we are automatically assuming that the person or the company that we're engaging in that conversation with is going to be coming at it from a perspective that we are diametrically opposed to. So we are not engaging in a good faith negotiation if we are not willing to acknowledge that it costs more to obtain a pineapple pineapple than it does an apple.
And as a result, we have an immediate increase in inflammation, toxicity, mistrust, and overall increased costs for everyone. That is definitely not fair.
And delays. You end up nickel and diming each other. We talk about, is this the hill we're going to die on? I will die on the hill where somebody is going to argue with me about who is allowed to do an informed consent, and it shouldn't have to cost that much. An informed consent is for us the most critical element of what we're going to do with the participant. I am willing to accept less money for an informed consent on a non-interventional trial than I am on an interventional trial with novel agents that require patients to change therapies. That is a hill I'm willing to die on. Am I going to die on a hill where we're arguing about whether or not $5 or $10 over the course of a study is going to make a difference? Absolutely not. But I don't like entering into a conversation assuming that we're operating from a position of there's no good faith in the interaction. And if you're giving me limited information about how we're expected to conduct this study, if you're going to bundle it all together and say, this is what you should be willing to expect to get paid without telling me which procedures are involved, we're automatically going to be at a disagreement. I recently had a study where a CRO offered me a budget, and having read the protocol, because I'm a clinical person, I realized that the 1X that they had placed on the procedure schedule actually represented 12 separate blood draws.
Wow. Oh, they just assume it's a central lab. That 1X is worth $65 to them, but it's going to cost you $300.
At least 12 separate blood draws. Yeah. And over that course of time, I have to pay multiple staff to be in the building early and to stay late because it's 12 separate blood draws. Please do not put that on my procedures schedule as a single X and expect that I should trust that you're negotiating in good faith.
If I were to hand you the microphone and I said, what would you like to tell the entire industry, sites, sponsors, CROs, vendors about fair market value and how we could make this actually fair, what would you tell them?
Transparency in the process, an honest dialogue about what is expected and how much it's going to cost to get there, and an understanding of the context that the work is going to occur in.
An understanding of what the sites might have to go through to perform this work.
Absolutely. And the other contexts where it's going to occur.
Good transparency, communication, understanding, collaborative nature, always considering what other people might need. Wenoah, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. It's been an excellent discussion. I look forward to sharing this with the audience.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
I'll talk to you later.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. Bye. Our next two guests comprise strong and informed legal and financial compliance thought leadership. Edye Edens is a senior research compliance consultant at First Class Solutions, a health law externship program director at Indiana University's McKinney School of Law, and a well-respected thought leader throughout the industry and social media. Her colleague, Eric Brochardt, is the associate director of financial compliance at Indiana University and has held research-specific financial compliance positions for years. Combined, the duo helps us to understand the intricacies of fair market value and its impact on the industry. I should also note Eric's statements are his personal views and do not necessarily reflect his employer's views. It's a true honor to have such an experienced lineup today, and I'm so very thankful they are willing to join in today's show. Please welcome with me Dr. Edye Edens and Eric Brochardt. Dr. Edye Edens, Eric Brochardt, how are you doing today?
Hey guys. Great. How about you, Eric?
I am good. How are you guys?
I am stoked about this conversation. What a powerhouse team to talk about this. Would both of you be willing to give a brief introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Edye Edens. I have the pleasure of being a senior compliance consultant with First Class Solutions. Many of you guys who follow me on LinkedIn know I am all things compliance and ethics when it comes to human subject research. And then I have the pleasure of sharing the stage with Eric Brochardt, please.
Yeah, I'm Eric Brochardt. I have worked for Indiana University for almost 10 years in the clinical research finance field, both negotiating budgets and most recently I am working in the financial compliance area in the Office of Clinical Research at IU. I am lucky enough to work with Edye on the side at First Class Solutions as a clinical research financial consultant.
Today, we're going to talk about our favorite subject ever, fair market value. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I've asked these questions to a previous interviewer, and when we're done, we're going to come back and we're going to compare these answers. Do you have any experience in the fair market value world?
As an attorney, you learn about the construct of fair market value in law school, very basic level, and what it's intended in a contractual setting to accomplish in terms of ensuring that both parties are having their needs met and aren't being taken advantage of. And then we see that principle obviously pull through to clinical research. You can tell immediately if someone in this industry particularly has worked in fair market value, because as soon as you say it, they're going to make a face or a noise. And it may be an expletive, and it may be a terrible face, or it may be, I don't even ever want to talk about that ever again. What do you think, Eric?
I've always thought the term fair market value represented something similar to like a leprechaun and Bigfoot when it comes to negotiating clinical trial budgets, because there's really not a standardized fair market value for what clinical procedures cost. It's different everywhere. Like a lot of different markets and different products and industries, the value changes depending on where you're located, what time of year it is. It's very difficult to even have a conversation about fair market value, especially when you're budgeting and negotiating with industry sponsors.
And I'd say that's true even outside the industry. From a contractual level, it seems like a really easy concept when you learn it for the first time in law school. Like, you're like, yeah, you can't take advantage of people. It's got to be a fair market value. And then you start diving into actual cases because it's part of your class. Did they assign fair market value and how was it done? And then it's, oh, wow, devil is in the details on these different industries to determine what it is and what it's not. It's really not a clear-cut concept even before we muddy the waters with everything that clinical research brings to the table.
We just call it fake market value. Just fake.
It feels like it sometimes.
Eric, can you walk me through your current understanding of the industry's fair market value processes?
No, I can't.
No?
Because I would say there isn't an industry fair market value process. When I'm negotiating budgets, I'm looking at what my expenses are and what it's going to cost for me to do these procedures on the trial. What's happening at other universities, what's happening on the sponsor's end and what their costs are not relevant to me. What I'm doing for my institution in my budget on this trial is all that I'm able to worry about.
When you're negotiating and your counterpart says, well, that's not fair market value. At one point in time, you probably said, well, how did you get your value?
Absolutely.
How do you think they get their conception of fair market value?
A lot of the responses I've gotten to that very question was, well, Medicare rate is insert a dollar price. That's really unfair of sponsors or CROs, whoever is negotiating, to use the Medicare rate, because there is not a hospital or clinic in this country that lives and breathes off of getting reimbursed by Medicare. They go bankrupt because it does not cover their costs all the time.
Just keep in mind, the average commercial rate in healthcare is 330% Medicare. That's important to note. It's like, okay, we acknowledge Medicare rate. Now let's talk about true commercial rate. I agree with this rate. As long as you take it times 330%, we'll be set. So that seems fair-ish. And I do like looking at Medicare rates because it is routinely updated. It's not like you're looking at, I call it the contract graveyard. We all know people going back into this big benchmark business. Edye, what do you know about the current fair market value processes, about how this is created, determined, and enforced?
What usually happens by the time I'm seeing it is it's a couple steps further down the road than when Eric's seeing it, in the sense of just timing. One, it's usually escalated. There's a reason you call the attorney. You're ready. You've had enough. You've been going back and forth with some budget negotiator who is not working or not escalating or not giving you the information you need. Where I sit down and look at it is when the minute they start quoting Medicare to me, I'm like, okay, and what legal rationale do my client have to follow Medicare? What requirement, what legal rationale, what ethical principle do they have? Where does it say in this contract that they have to follow Medicare? You don't even reference it. You haven't explained to me how you reached your fair market value conclusion. I almost always, if I'm working with a site in a regular consulting pattern, make sure that my sites have documented and gone through exactly what their costs are. Really detailed effort tracking, not just what their CTMS allows for, so that when we make these asks and when we make these negotiations, we have incredible data and metrics so that we're not in any way saying, hey, we reached our assessment just because. No, we reached it based on numbers and figures that are accurate to this year and this quarter and work that we do on other trials right now with all the appropriate vendors in play and with the exact staff that exists today. And we're giving you the real price of what it's going to cost us. And essentially have the conversation, what is fair market value? How did you get to yours? Why and how are you going to bind me to any particular quantification table? And then usually where they want to go in the conversation is, well, Well, we have to worry about fair market value from the perspective of what if we paid you too much?
So they pull the old Sunshine and Stark out and they say, here you
Oh,
go.
and the best part is they always look at you like, I'm not sure if you know this, but there's something called the Sunshine Act. And I'm like, I'm not sure if you know this. I'm a licensed attorney. I don't say that to in any way be arrogant. For me, it's, look, project manager on the other end of this particular conversation, let's orient ourselves to the room. I know more about Sunshine Act. I know more about fair market value from a legal perspective than you do, which is why I am giving you the opportunity to tell me what principle and what thread are you calling upon that I should be listening to you right now. Just saying Sunshine Act doesn't do it. Nobody wants to be dinged for overpaying or doing anything that would be viewed unethical in terms of patient referrals. There is a reason that these particular acts and regulations exist because it's happened. We've had bad actors and we had to regulate against it. And unfortunately, it still happens. It's a very real problem. And I agree with that. What is laughable in this moment is when you use that particular principle to then justify massively underpaying the research site. Fair market value is supposed to be fair on both sides. I understand your argument. You don't want to pay too much and get in trouble with the government, and you shouldn't. That's right. But that doesn't give you carte blanche to then completely underpay me.
And of course, when someone throws out Sunshine Stark, then you throw out arm's reach transaction, right?
Yep, immediately. I don't even have to go into that. I sit there and say, justify that. Walk that through for me. You can't just say Sunshine Act to me. I know what it is. I've read it.
Yeah, I know Sunshine and Stark, and how it's directly associated with Medicare, Medicaid, and not necessarily all of the clinical research specific activities of a coordinator. Therefore, you are utilizing fair market value in an unjust
You're
way.
overusing it. I mean, you're overplaying your hand.
You are completely manipulating fair market value to underfund a study. What is more unethical, overpaying a site or underpaying a site?
With underpaying a site, you run into the possibility of violating a different Medicare rule, the payer of last resort rules, and other rules that oversee clinical trial finance. In an audit, if Medicare finds that a site has been charging less than Medicare rate, either at the beginning or at the end of a 20-year study, they're violating Medicare's rules. Medicare has stated they have to be the lowest paid for clinical procedures, especially on a clinical trial, and they have to be the last resort for making payments. Underpaying is a problem. It's not just when you negotiate the budget from the very beginning. A lot of these cancer trials that I've seen are open for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. If you negotiate that at the very beginning of that trial at the Medicare rate,
it's fully underfunded by the time the ink's dry.
Right.
By the next time the Medicare increases their rates, you're violating without even changing or doing anything. And how often are sponsors willing to renegotiate? They aren't.
I've had that when sponsors had a 2-year trial and they went into a 3-year extension and insisted they didn't want to renegotiate the budget. So have you ever done a quantification of what sites actually get paid versus percentage Medicare? Most of the time it does go below Medicare.
Yeah.
So you are, in fact, still breaking a law.
I would argue not nearly as succinct and tight of a case as what Eric is referencing with the Medicare legislation, but the FDA is very clear about adequate resources. We're equally as hard on an investigator about, do you have the bandwidth to take on this study, as they are in the sponsor regulations that are right there in the 312 series and right there in the 812 series. And I don't hesitate to pull those out, because without adequate resources, so what are we going to cut? Are we going to cut how we track our protocol deviations? Are we going to cut our coordinator time? What would you like me to cut here? It's like the same concept of the arguments we have around fair market value and patient recruitment specifically, where everybody wants to give you a flat fee and say $4,000 and bring in 3 unicorns for that $4,000.
Yep.
And you go, how did you arrive at this $4,000? You just pulled that out of a hat. I can give you the exact numbers, figures, and metrics it's going to take me to get to your 3 unicorns within very close estimated patterns and quantification. What are you basing yours on? Help me understand how we're reaching it. And that's the part that's always gotten me about this whole negotiation is, when did we ever begin agreeing to budgets where we did not say how we reached our numbers?
I have an answer for that. There are many institutions in the country who are not allowed to negotiate. They have to accept what they are given because they are state funded, which means that they are not allowed to make a margin. They are not incentivized, nor are they punished if they are underfunded, because they are state subsidized. And so those contracts are feeding into this giant contract graveyard and completely underfunding the entire industry.
That hurts my soul to even hear that is happening. And And there's often, and I hear this from even from our study teams, the misinterpretation of what not-for-profit means or state-funded actually means. It doesn't mean that you have to live in poverty, go broke, and barely be able to turn your lights on. It just means that any additional funds you make on a trial, on any contract, has to be reinvested into your missions and values.
What are the benefits of true fair market values?
The number one benefit is it makes the negotiations easier, where you get a draft budget initially with a new protocol, and it's going to be within your range.
One, negotiations. Let's think how often it gets incredibly adversarial, but also how often those negotiations eat up months of valuable time while patients are waiting. That didn't make anybody happy. And it creates a really negative relationship right up front. I don't care what industry you're in. I don't care if you're curing cancer or you are doing any other job under the sun. If you work hard at what you do, you deserve to be compensated appropriately for the work performed. So the idea that we're categorically, knowingly undercompensating the people that are truly carrying out the trial, they're the ones who are facing the patients. They're the ones who are entering your data. They're the ones who are cleaning your data. They're the ones who are auditing and monitoring your data. They're the ones who are getting you to the finish line. Why would you make those people the ones you piss off? The sponsors make it out to be, or the CROs make it out to be like, well, the sites are just in it for the money. They're just here to price gouge. They think that the sponsors are made of gold. I see that argument. But the other side of the coin is what they're arguing for isn't usually overpayment. They're almost always trying to get from underpayment to just payment.
I've always felt like there's a huge disconnect. If you look at the people that are involved in this entire conversation, you have probably medical directors at a sponsor that are choosing the site. They then pass along to somebody within their organization, and then that person in their organization passes that on to a CRO, who then passes the information on to the study site. And then me as a budget negotiator, I get that, and then I go to my coordinator and say, I need to talk about this budget, what's going to be happening. Coordinator says, well, let me talk to the PI, who originally talked to the original medical director at the sponsor. And now you've got 7, 8, 9 people in between. And I think there's a disconnect on both ends, honestly.
Yeah.
The budget negotiator in the middle is going, but if we take less than that's going to cover our expenses, we have all sorts of legal ramifications for that, and we jeopardize our grants.
To be fair, I think that's happening on their side of the fence too. And the poor budget person who's finally negotiating with you was probably just told, do not pay more than X.
Absolutely.
Yep, here's a bell curve. You have to stay in the bell curve.
With no rationale. How do we move away from this notion of, well, that's just what got negotiated, even if it was 10 years ago?
They're doing it in good faith. The number one thing I put in every SOP of every site that I work with is all study activities must be fully funded. The sponsor, when they sign a contract, they agree to abide by the SOPs of the institution. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if something is underfunded, they are legally obligated to remediate.
Yeah, in the contract.
What do you think are the limitations of our current fair market value systems?
I think the ambiguity of it. Going back to what we talked about earlier, I've asked, which fair market value are you referring to? The fair market values are going to be different regardless of where you are. And I think that ambiguity in what we're doing right now causes the most contention in these discussions.
It leads to misexpectations, even planning, sometimes miscommunication. Sometimes I wonder if sponsors are building their entire foundation of their clinical program on a false premise of fair market value. It wasn't even fair when they looked at it.
That puts the CRO's budget at risk also, because generally CROs are paid like a lump sum, or they have a contract so much that they're going to get paid from sponsors that they have to come under. That sets them up to fail right away.
What I think the shortcoming of the current system is frankly, we don't have one. It's who can yell louder, who can push back across the table more, who has a nastier counsel. It's a matter of who can basically withstand the negotiation better. We still don't have what I would like to see, something that we're all playing from the same playbook. No one's denying that a sponsor should never make money on what they do, and no one's saying a CRO shouldn't make money on what they do. Somehow we all got it into our heads that there's not enough food on the table, and so we all have to swipe what we can and fight for it. I disagree with that principle. There's more than enough work to be done in this industry. If people would focus less on how I get mine and think a little more about how you're going to get yours and reach a fair market value system that was truly truly accounted for cost, and no more, no less, and wasn't an overpayment system, but wasn't an underpayment system either.
Why do we think that fair market value is so disparate compared to the actual costs of doing research?
I think it goes back to that disconnect, honestly.
The giant chain of people that never talk to each other?
Yeah, the giant chain of people that never talk to each other, but also have a very definitive line between them as site and sponsor. I want to say everybody goes into a negotiation with the best intentions, but I don't think that the two people on either side of that line negotiating feel that the other one has the best intentions. That disconnect, however that gap can get bridged, is going to help.
I agree completely. There's two categories of what I see. There's truly egregious, which is usually what winds up on my LinkedIn feed when I posted last week. It's entirely unacceptable business practice to basically negotiate and sign with an entity and then walk away from the engagement entirely. And that's not what the regulations suggest is ethical in our industry. And yet it happens on every trial, anytime a CRO is involved, practically. And that is just wrong. The sponsor's not even trying to mask that they're not involved. They're literally turning everything over to the CRO. Okay, then let's say in the good faith situations, the folks at the sponsors who are negotiating and or the folks at the CROs who are often negotiating with the folks at the site have never been at the site. They have no idea what it actually really costs and if the site is in fact, frankly, bullshitting you, inflating something, or maybe really does need those resources to make it happen. And because they have no BS meter, because maybe they haven't done it themselves, they're just told to presume everything the site is saying is BS. So you're setting this adversarial situation up. Likewise, to be fair, how often is the person doing the budget negotiation at the site spent doing budget negotiations at a CRO or a sponsor? This is what we've created. We've created this complete pressure compromise. And so even when you come in a good faith situation, you're being pressed, you don't have a table of information to start this conversation from, and everyone's coming in either presuming the other side doesn't have good faith or frankly being told not to have good faith for the other side. The only things that I've seen that have rectified these types of situations is when you have some type of a contained or controlled environment where you basically force a cross-training of the culture. But how do we get the sponsors, CROs, and sites on this massive scale in one room?
And I wonder if the industry has become so inflamed that we're literally investing money to manage a toxic environment.
Oh, yeah.
Where that same money could be redirected into doing a solution so that everyone saves money.
I firmly believe that's happening. How do we get everyone to come to the table and go, look, this could save you money. This could save you time. This could save your people's sanity and make their jobs, frankly, far more satisfying if we had a rubric that told us what the fair market value was and we cut all this extra out. Just think what we could be accomplishing with that saved amount of time and efficiency. Look, we are in an ecosystem where we rely on each other. And yes, we all have different stakes in that industry and our goals and our results at the end are varied, but we do all agree we're here to create innovation and to improve patient lives.
Yeah.
So let's get on board and let's find a way to include all the right stakeholders so that everybody has a voice and begin coming back to the table in a very different way.
Eric, Edye, if I were to hand you the microphone and I were to say, what would you like to tell site sponsors, CROs, vendors, the entire industry about fair market value, where it is in the industry now, and where you'd like to see it go, what would you tell them?
The first thing that comes to mind is for both sides, transparency is important. Continue to go into your negotiations with the best intentions, but also share what those intentions are with the other side, because that I think is where we're losing a lot of ground. When it starts to get contentious, it goes from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat. Anything we can do to avoid that and get these trials negotiated in a much quicker time frame to get our studies open to accrual and treating patients quicker is only going to be beneficial for everyone all around. And it will eventually, like we talked about, will be cheaper.
I just got done serving lunch at my child's elementary school. So I'm thinking of this of how would I say this to kindergarten to 8th graders in a way that would be appropriate. And here's what I would say. What we refer to as industry, sponsors, CRO, side of this. Whatever you think fair market value is, it's more. And I'm not trying to bankroll you. It's more. Try spending some time in some of these smaller sites' shoes and remember they're producing amazing work for you. The other side of that coin, sites, we hear you. We hear what you are saying in the industry. We hear your needs. There are a lot of us out there who are coming together and working really hard to see and make change in the industry. So please be a part of it, but be a part of the positive forward momentum so that we all bring that transparency to the table. And then I would say, all of you, look around. You are in the same ecosystem. You rely on each other. You need one another. So start acting like that.
Edye, I was waiting for you to just say, play nice.
When you get up in the morning and you're having one of those terrible negotiations, no matter which side of the fence you're on, remember it's for the patient.
Yes.
Don't lose sight. That's what I want the industry to get back to. What we're here, why we're really here, and what we can really change. The impacts we can actually really make can impact patients. It could save lives. And this is where we got to do better. We just have to do better.
Eric, Edye, thanks so much for coming on to CRP and Central. I can't wait to share this story with the audience.
I can't wait to hear it with the comparator. I think that's going to be very interesting because that's a completely different setting and set of information.
Talk to y'all later.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye. Wenoah has over 20 years of experience in clinical research from the streets of Los Angeles to rural communities in New Mexico. If you asked 100 people about fair market value, you'd receive 100 different answers because there really isn't an adopted industry standard. Proper fair market value helps to level the playing field, and ideally it should prevent positive or negative financial pressures from compromising scientific integrity and ethical performance. In its current form, however, the mysterious fair market value we experience does not consider the scarcity of regional resources. It does not stratify the cost of specific trial needs. It creates a max value without consideration for true services or costs. It lacks transparency, dialogue, and relevant data, and as a result, it forces our industry into a paradigm of comparing pineapples to apples. Sponsors and sites should participate in professional partnerships of transparency, open dialogue, and mutual understanding of trial context. However, the disconnect between parties only appears to be separating further, and as a result, we observe automatic mistrust during negotiations without good faith, a combination that benefits no one in an environment that operates without integrity. Eric and Edye have served as industry compliance experts from patient safety and ethics to financial regulation for years. Fair market value is different for everyone. It is not clear-cut, and it may as well be associated with leprechauns and Bigfoot because we've never really seen a true industry standard in existence. In theory, proper fair market value should streamline negotiations, save time to help patients, and ensure appropriate compensation. Not too much, not too little. Instead, we see echoes of fair market value and tension from contract graveyards and references, not of commercially viable rates, but rather government values that, if adopted as the norm, risk substantial consequences through underfunding and non-compliance. We experience a massive disconnect of communication between every stakeholder, which applies a negative, misinformed pressure to complete work, and combined with the ambiguity and inherent siloed mistrust of current fair market values, an adversarial environment without established systems. To address our fair market values, we must address transparency. We must communicate our intentions to our collaborators and consider site perspectives. And although many are coming together to advocate for site changes, it's important for everyone to remember what we do is and always will be for the patients. All of today's guests unanimously confirmed there is no fair market value industry standard, that fair market value, if executed properly, should promote positive and ethical scientific integrity, and that our industry's focus should be on the patients instead of haggling over prices. And while Wenoah focused on the need to assess resource scarcity in fair market calculations, Eric and Edye discussed in depth the potential legal consequences of over or underpaying sites and their impacts on the industry as a whole. So, why are fair market value payments to sites so inaccurate to the actual costs of performing clinical trials? Compared, our guests provided similar and aligned responses. To address fair market value inaccuracies, we must address transparency, communication, and standardization. Provide clear description and accurate data that explains how we predict our costs. Maintain an open dialogue and strong communication, not only between organizations, but interdepartmentally with our colleagues, work as an industry, and agree upon a standardized method for fair market value, and in the end, focus on what matters most, the patient, and not on the means to serve. Thank you for listening to our very special fair market value episode. Everyone knows this system is broken, and we all want to change it for the better. The challenge, however, is industry-wide, and it will take strong community and collaboration to once and for all resolve problems and build fast, efficient, and quality research for our future. Thank you to Wenoah, Eric, and Edye for sharing their experiences today. Thank you to our community voice volunteers, Dave Hine, Amy Sitneck, and Alex Baffa for building today's CRPN short. Finally, thank you to my CRPN Central sponsors for helping to make this episode possible. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CRPN Central.